We continue our talks on the history of the great figures of Canadian history. Obviously, it is just a survey, just a sampling of these great people that brought the faith and civilization into our lands. Especially for those of who speak English, whose English is the mother tongue. This history of Canada, you probably have never heard. It's not taught. It's not taught anymore in French Canada. In English Canada, it's definitely not taught. That's why I want to tell you about it. But I'm doing just a very simple presentation of it to give you some ideas. We have limited time. One little talk per month is not very much. There's so much to say. I'd like to open some ways and encourage you to read about these things. I encourage you to read the Canadian Dictionary of Biography. You find that online. And some of these information I'm giving you, these are from there. And especially the one on Jeanne Mance we're going to see today in Maisonneuve. The one on Jeanne Mance is by Mrs. Davelouis, who is the best biographer of Jeanne Mance. So that dictionary has some very good authors for very good articles. So the Canadian Biographical Dictionary, or Biographical Dictionary of Canada. Few cities can glorify to have been founded at the request of heaven. And that is the case of Montreal. A French historian, Georges Goyot, qualified that whole period that we are seeing of mystical era, l'épopée mystique. And it's not exaggerated when you start looking at all these elements putting the various actors together. There was a request of heaven, and for the actors to meet one another, there was often, as we will see today, also divine intervention. One of the great miracles, we can say, of the foundation of Montreal is the conversions, the meeting of 5 people who were to be the backbone of this foundation. One we have seen, Jérôme Leroyer de la Dauversière. We have spoken about the others, but I just summarize a little bit. Another is Father Jean-Jacques Ollier, known as Monsieur Ollier. They would call the priest in these days by Mr., like Mr. Vincent for Saint Vincent de Paul, and Monsieur Ollier. Paul Chomédé de Maisonneuve, Jeanne Mance, and Sainte Margaret Bourgeois. So we're going to see the last 3 today. Great personalities of that great story. We have seen Jérôme Leroyer de la Dauversière, so born 1597, died in 1659. And we saw, if you have a good memory, we saw that Monsieur de la Dauversière met Father Ollier at one stage. He was in Paris. He had this mission assigned to him by heaven directly in 1630, 1631, 32. He goes to Paris a few years later. We're in 1635, and in the vestibule, the waiting room of a priest, a famous Jesuit priest in Paris, he sees another priest, It was Monsieur Audier. And as if they had been old friends, they had not seen each other for years. They looked at each other and they fell in each other's arms. They had never seen each other. But both had seen each other in a dream. And when they saw each other, they said, "I know you." And they said that at the same time. And because they were both going to be the essential instrument of the foundation of Ville-Marie. Monsieur de la Dauversière is the one who organized all the logistics for this foundation. Monsieur Audier was perhaps more on the spiritual side, directly himself, and gradually with the congregation that he will found, the Fathers of Saint-Sulpice. So Monsieur Audier is contemporary to all these people, born in 1608. He died in 1657, pretty young, 49 years old. After a little bit of a liberal upbringing, St. Francis de Sales told him to become a priest, which he did. But he became a bit lax, and eventually there was a conversion in his life. Then he became blind, completely blind, like St. Paul, and he was cured at the house of Loreto, the house of Our Lady. And it was after that that his life changed radically. We're talking about the late 1630s, mid-late 1630s, until his death. He belonged to what is called the French spirituality of the 17th century, which has great names like Saint Vincent de Paul, Saint John Eudes, Bossuet, Jean-Baptiste de La Salle, Saint Louis de Montfort, all the spirituality of these great men. And he was given a parish in Paris. I think it's on Boulevard Saint-Germain. So pretty not far from Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay, the parish of Saint-Sulpice. Saint Sulpice. And he made it a model parish such that the Archbishop of Paris asked him to found a seminary. And thus he was led to found a congregation of priests who would focus on the training of priests, seminaries, the whole spirituality of the priesthood and of the Mass. And there's a great consanguinity, a great relationship entre Saint-Sulpice and the Society of St. Pius X. There are, in the history, of a different congregation that would do seminaries. Saint Jean Eudes would do the same thing in Caen. He started the Eudistes. It was the seminaries, the training of priests. We need priests. We need holy priests. We need well-trained priests. And that was, so we're talking about 1640. You might be surprised if I say that was in application of the Council of Trent. When did the Council of Trent end? 1563. We're talking about 75 years before. So some priests are starting to apply the Council of Trent. St. Charles Borromeo will do that in Milan right after the Council of Trent. But in France, it was these men who did that. So a spirituality all based on the Holy Eucharist, the priesthood, and he was a member of the Company of the Blessed Sacrament. If you recall, we saw that. These bodyguards of the Holy Eucharist, priests bringing communion to sick people, and these men protecting the priests at the time of some Protestant difficulties. Later on, just a few words about him, and then we'll go to the others. But later on, the Sulpician father, les Messieurs de Saint-Sulpice, the gentlemen of Saint-Sulpice, will take over the ownership of Montreal. So you have the Society of the 100 Associates. They will sell the island of Montreal to the Company of Montreal, of Our Lady of Montreal. But by 1663, the Company of Montreal can't make it anymore. Monsieur de la Dauversière is dead. A lot of the key people were dead. And so the Saint-Sulpice Fathers took over Montreal. So Montreal, and for a long time, if I'm not mistaken, it's for like 200 years, Montreal was owned by the Congregation of Saint-Sulpice. So his canonization process has been open. I think he's venerable. So we have Monsieur de la Dauversière, this father of 5 children, and who had a message from heaven to found a religious community in Sisters of St. Joseph, and then to found a colony in Montreal, on the island of Montreal. So he met Monsieur Ollier, and they put their plans together, their ideas together. So it was a network of priests. A lot of the Jesuits were involved, were spiritual directors of the elite in France. There's great friendship at this level of great holiness, a great quest for holiness. So this is where Paul de Chomedy, Sieur de Maisonneuve, comes in. 1612, born in 1612, died in 1676. He came from Champagne, Neuville-sur-Vanne, near Champagne. That's where they make champagne. That's where it comes from, in the east of France. And he was in the military service. Well, he was very military oriented. From the age of 13, he was very eager to be a soldier. He participated in the war against Holland in 1625. He was only 13 years old. So he was a soldier in his soul. But he wanted to use his military skill at the service of God, like the Crusaders. He did not like the worldly, sinful life, libertine life in the military camps. And he preferred to be in his tent, to pray, to study, to play lute. How do you say the lute? Lute, to play the lute. It's a bit like a little guitar, if you want. And so he brought these instruments to Montreal right away when he came to Montreal. And it was by reading what was the most popular reading in that whole society of French Catholic in these days, the relation of the Jesuits. It was the book. There was one book every year, and in this high-class society, educated society, everybody was reading this. I think it started in 1632. It was about one book a year. We have the whole collection in our seminary. I saw it a few weeks ago. I mean, you have about from 1632 to 1680-ish. So the missionaries would write their stories, what happened over there in New France, and it was sold like hot bread in France. Everybody was reading, and that's how a lot of people heard about Montreal, about Canada, and had a desire to go to Canada. So Maisonneuve, who did not like the milieu of the military where he was, went to see a Jesuit, Father Charles Lallemand. I think he's the brother of Saint Gabriel Lallemand, one of the Canadian martyrs, to see what could I do with my life. He wanted to fight for the kingdom of Christ. And Father Lallemand, so we're talking about 1639. So Maisonneuve, 1612. So he's 27 years old, a young military young captain. He goes to see this priest. Father, what can I do to extend the kingdom of God? 1639, Monsieur de la Dauversière was starting to be known in a whole network of priests and people in Paris. And so Father Lallemand told him, well, there's a man that could be the man you're looking for. If you remember, this Maisonneuve was in a hotel, and de la Dauversière at the same time was looking for somebody, and they met in the hotel. And Maisonneuve was in the hotel. De la Dauversière came in, and de la Dauversière spoke about his plan about going to Canada, and Maisonneuve said, I'm your man. Can I go with you? Can I be involved in this expedition? And that's how Maisonneuve became the head of the expedition to New France. So he was 27 years old. And so they left on May 9th, 1641. So there was two ships. One left from La Rochelle, the other from Dieppe. Actually, the one from La Rochelle left with Jeanne Mance. The one from Dieppe, Maisonneuve left with the one from Dieppe. And the La Rochelle ship arrived first. The other one was stuck in the storm a few times. Arrived about a month later. There were 54 first pioneers of Ville-Marie, 50 men and 4 women. Maisonneuve had the courage and all the prudence of a true leader. He had no personal ambition. His purpose was the purpose of Monsieur de la Dauversière, to open a colony on the island of Montreal to convert the what they called them at that time, the savages, the Aborigines, the Indians. That was his goal. His goal. As is the first biographer, Sister Marie Morin. So it's a biography that goes to 1695 and goes back to 1697. He was no more concerned of money than of dirt. Okay, so he was not interested in making money. He was interested in founding a colony that would be missionary. And that's unique in Montreal. The purpose was not the commerce of fur, although he realized it was necessary to bring some income for the colony, but his purpose was not that. As you know, when they got to Montreal, Governor Montmagny tried to stop the expedition. So we're talking about August 41, when they saw these ships arriving and we're going to open a colony on the island of Montreal. They said, what? Montreal? And they tried to change their mind. And Maisonneuve said, I have not come here to discuss the opportunity of a foundation. I have come here to execute a plan. And whether they be, even if there were as many Iroquois on the island of Montreal as there are trees, we will go. We will go. So, a number of things I have said. They finally arrived in Montreal on May 17, 1942. They started a colony. Maisonneuve had to make a number of trips back to France. as you can see in the timeline. He went back to France in 1645 and 46. He came back in the spring of 46, and he had to go back in the autumn of 46 back to France because they were at first, say, 50, 54, but some of them died, but say 50 pioneers. But the Iroquois were a real threat. And so when they built that fort, it was a walled city. So to do some guarding, to do whatever, if they had to leave the fort, they had to be protected. So it was very dangerous. And some people over the years, the first about 20 years it lasted, the threat of the Iroquois, until le régiment de Carignan came, until the regiment of Carignan came in 1662, and they slaughtered a lot of Iroquois, and they calmed down from that moment. But until 62, the Iroquois threat was pretty bad, and it was dangerous to get out of the fort. And some ladies were captured and killed, and some men were found dead and scalped. So it was difficult. It was very difficult. So Maisonneuve had to go back to France a number of times. And one particular trip, which was, I would say, perhaps the lowest moment, the most delicate moment in the history of Ville-Marie, was in 1651. 1651, they had about very few men to protect the fort of Ville-Marie. And Maisonneuve, discussing with Jeanne Mance, who was in charge of the hospital in Ville-Marie, was wondering, what to do. And then Jeanne Mance had an inspiration which actually saved Ville-Marie. And that inspiration was, she had been given, we will speak of her in a moment, but Jeanne Mance had a great benefactress, Madame d'Aiguillon. Just like Sainte Mary of the Incarnation had Madame de la Peltrie, if you recall her. Well, Jeanne Mance had a great benefactress who financed the foundation of the hospital in Ville-Marie. And Madame d'Aiguillon, who was the unknown benefactress, had given Jeanne Mance 20,000 pounds. I don't know how it would be today, $200,000, a huge amount, for the hospital of Ville-Marie. That donation was tagged. And Jeanne Mance thought, if we do not get more men to protect the fort, there will be no more Ville-Marie left very soon. So we will not be able to build a hospital. So she told Maisonneuve, listen, or maybe it was just promised by Madame d'Aiguillon, but she had practically that amount of money. And she told Maisonneuve, listen, I have this amount of money. You need to go back to France. Recruit. He was hoping to recruit 200 men. He came back with 100, 130, but a number of them died in the trip. And she told him the name of that rich benefactress. And there was an interesting story because he went to France, so he met some of the Jesuits, and he made his way to the house of this rich benefactress, having heard that she was very interested in the foundation of Ville-Marie, that she was following very closely. But he had to pretend that he did not know that she was the unknown benefactress of Jeanne Mance, who was his first assistant. And so there was this meeting between Maisonneuve and Madame d'Aiguillon, and Maisonneuve is trying to ask her, to explain the situation in Ville-Marie, and he also speaks of this wonderful lady called Jeanne Mance, and she's having this hospital over there, and she's doing wonderful work, and he's praising Jeanne Mance all the way. And of course, Madame d'Aiguillon is like the godmother of Jeanne Mance, and eventually he says, well, we really, if we don't have enough more help, the Ville-Marie will be destroyed by Iroquois, and she gives him 20,000 pounds. And with that, he was able to build his recruit. In that trip, 1651, 1653, in 52, 53, that's early 53, he goes to the city of Troyes to see his sister. And now you're going to see a connection. His sister was the superior of a community called the Congregation of Notre Dame. They were cloistered because every community of nuns in these days were cloistered. We saw that Marie de l'Incarnation was an Ursuline nun, and she was cloistered. And at this time, when in the colony in Quebec had just a few hundred people, they had a cloistered convent school, which is incredible, because how will they live? They have to live with the donation of the people. And when there's very, very few people and people are starving because it takes time to plow fields, to cut the trees, to plow fields. Don't forget, all these forests have never been harvested. And so the trees were gigantic in these days, far bigger than our trees today, because so many of our forests have been cut and replanted over the centuries. So Maisonneuve goes to Troyes to see his sister, who's cloistered. And he's talking with her sister, Louise de Maisonneuve, in the parlor. And while he's there in the parlor, two ladies come in. And one lady, seeing this gentleman, so how old is he then? In 53, so he's 41 years old. And she sees him and she says, "My priest! My priest!" And everybody says, "What do you mean?" "He's the man I saw in my dream, which I thought he was a priest." And she was Marguerite Bourgeois. Marguerite Bourgeois, we'll come to her shortly. So Marguerite Bourgeois she was born in 20, so she's 33 years old. So it was in the parlor of that convent whose superior was the sister of Maisonneuve that she met Maisonneuve, and she had that great desire to go to Canada, but she never knew how to fulfill that desire for a young lady to go among the Indians. I mean, it's not very safe. Like if I tell you, would you like to go to China and teach catechism? I said, well, a young lady there, 25 years old, is alone, And so, but that's what happened. And so Marguerite Bourgeois, after some hesitation, but the Jesuit says, go with him. So she went with Maisonneuve on that return trip of 1653. And when she arrived in Quebec, she met Jeanne Mance, who was there. And so together they went back to Ville-Marie. So that was the beginning of a 20-year-old very intimate friendship between Jeanne Mance and Marguerite Bourgeois. So Marguerite Bourgeois arrived in Montreal 11 years after Jeanne Mance. 1642, the foundation of Montreal. 1653, Marguerite Bourgeois arrived. We'll speak of her in a minute. So Maisonneuve is there. Maisonneuve is there in 1660 when, again, there was a very serious threat of the Iroquois. They were getting some information that the Iroquois were coming in throngs, many hundreds, perhaps thousands, to eliminate everybody living in Montreal. In 1660, that's when a young man called Dollard des Ormeaux. Dollard des Ormeaux, young man, he was in his early 20s. Everybody knew in the fort, there were just a few hundred then. Everybody knew it was extremely critical. Something had to be done. Or else everybody had to move back to Quebec, which they did not want to do. So Dollard des Ormeaux and 16 men. Well, Dollard went himself to Maisonneuve and explained to him his plan. Maisonneuve, who was a military, who was a soldier, agreed. So Maisonneuve was the governor of Montreal. For a while, there was two governors, one of Quebec and one in Montreal. So you have to know that. Later on, it unified all of it. Maisonneuve said, okay, I think somebody has to do it. So Dollard got 16 of the young men of Ville-Marie. They went to confession. They went to Mass. They made a vow to Our Lady to give the last drop of blood to save Ville-Marie. So they were going to fight the Iroquois and sacrifice their life to try to stop them. Either kill enough of Indians, like it happens in the Bible, like the Maccabees, 10 against 1,000 sometime. So they probably were inspired by the Maccabees and the lives of the saints. And they left. They left a first time, and then they met some Iroquois. There was a few skirmishes, and they had to come back. And they left again, a second time. Then they went along the Outaouais River and near Lonceau, so just coming this way from Montreal. They found an old abandoned fort. Who had made this fort, whatever. It was a little bit on the hill, a few, maybe 100 yards away, I don't know exactly how far, but from the water. And as they started to settle there, then they saw the first hordes of Iroquois arriving. Immediately, they went up to the fort and prepared the defense. And they made a mistake. It was so precipitated that they made a mistake which eventually cost their lives to a certain extent. They forgot to take water. And so they were a little bit on the hill. The water was down there. And so the fort was surrounded by the Iroquois. And then the battle lasted 5 or 6 days. So they were the 16, I should say. Some Hurons had joined them. Hurons and Algonquins had joined, about 40 of them. The first waves of Iroquois were 200-300. Eventually there was 1,000. But they were so shrewd, these 16 men, not to let know to the enemies how few they were. So don't show up, Each bullet must hit its target, okay? And they start shooting and never missing one. and they lasted 5 days. During these 5 days, some of the Indians who were with them deserted and went to join the Iroquois. So at the end, there were only the 16 left, and one by one, they were being killed. And at the end, there was just a handful, and they were running out of ammunitions. And I think it's Dollard himself who at the end, he says, listen, we don't have any more bullets, whatever. And the fort was surrounded by the Iroquois, and he took the barrel of powder, and he was about to throw it on them to make a bomb, so to speak, but then whatever happened, it kind of exploded, and they died. But then the Iroquois found out there was only 16 guys there. Some of the Hurons had joined them, the Algonquins, 2 escaped. And that's with the 2 that went back to Montreal that we know the story, thanks to these two Hurons. But then the Iroquois saw there was only 16 Frenchmen. So historians will give different interpretation of what happens next. But don't forget, we are dealing with men who are fighting for the protection of this colony dedicated to Our Lady. This colony founded at the express request of heaven. And these young men have all made a vow to Our Lady to die for her, to protect her domain. That historian won't say, but that's the fact. So what happened is, again, you may find different interpretation, but one of the interpretation that is given by some historian is that when the Iroquois found out the only 16 French men were in that fort, and they had lost maybe hundreds of their own men, they said, if 16 killed hundreds of ours, what will 100 do? And they say, it's not safe to continue. And whatever happened, the Iroquois turned back and went back to their lands near in upper New York State and all these areas. But the sacrifice of Dollard des Ormeaux reached its purpose, or fulfilled its purpose. It stopped the invasion of the Iroquois, invasion of Ville-Marie. And that's why May 24th, which is now, especially in the English world, is the Queen's Day, Queen Victoria's Day. But in Catholic history of Canada is Dollard des Ormeaux. It's the day of Dollard. That's when whether it was that day, it was one of the day. It's a day to commemorate the battle of Dollard des Ormeaux, who saved Montreal. And if Ville-Marie had fallen, Three Rivers would have fallen, Quebec would have fallen. So the sacrifice of these men was certainly blessed by God. Finally, in 1665, there's a new governor in Quebec, Tracy, who, for whatever reason, probably because, so he had been appointed Governor General of Quebec. He was encouraging the sales of eau de vie, of alcohol to the Indians, which Bishop de Laval was condemning so much. Monsieur de Tracy most likely felt that to have another governor on Ville-Marie, on the island of Ville-Marie, was a competition. So he gave orders to young Louis XIV, who was the king then, to recall Maisonneuve, get rid of him. And in 1665, Louis XIV calls back Maisonneuve, and he goes back to Paris, and this is the beauty of his life. Maisonneuve never married. There was a time when, it's interesting, there's a time, because here's Maisonneuve, who's the governor of the young colony. There's one young woman who's just a little bit younger than him, Jeanne Mance. Later on is going to be Marguerite Bourgeois. Okay, all three probably have the vow of chastity. These people have a very intense spiritual life. They could have got married, but they went there to work for God. And Maisonneuve never married. And you see his humility and his obedience. He never said, come on, I've been here for 20 years. We've organized all this colony here. And remember where we saw at the end of last conference, the foundation of Montreal was not financed by the king. It was all financed by private individuals. Contrary to Quebec, Montreal is the project of La Dauversière. He's the one who wanted this project. So, and the governor of Quebec then did not want that. There was some tension between them, but it was under Tracy 20 years later that Maisonneuve had to go back. He went back to Paris and lived very privately. Marguerite Bourgeois when she went back to France in 1670, Marguerite Bourgeois went to see him to give him some news of New France, of the foundation. And he finally died in 1676. A great man, Maisonneuve, great man. He's the founder of Montreal. So we have de la Dauversière with Monsieur Ollier, who had the thought of this whole strategy, this whole plan, supernaturally inspired. They never came. They never came to Montreal. They organized everything. They inspired the men and the women to go. And at a distance, Monsieur Ollier prepared the other priests who went to Montreal. And we will see in a minute, Monsieur Ollier dead will cure Jeanne Mance, will be a miracle. And but at Maisonneuve, they're all people who are aiming at a very high degree of union with God, which is very beautiful.